The year is 878, the world is mud and mist. In the vast, treacherous swamps of Somerset, a lone figure moves through the reeds, a ghost in his own kingdom. He is a king without a throne, a commander without an army. His name is Alfred. Just months ago, he was the ruler of Wessex, the last free Anglo-Saxon kingdom in Britain. Now he is a fugitive, hunted by an enemy that seems less like an army and more like a force of nature. They call themselves the Great Heathen Army. The Vikings, they have devoured every other kingdom. Northumbria, a land of saints and scholars, has fallen. East Anglia, its king martyred, is gone. Mercia, the great power of the Midlands, has been broken and subjugated. Only Wessex remains, and Wessex is now little more than this one man, hiding in the wetlands, his dreams haunted by the screams of burning monasteries and the sight of Viking longships gliding silently up the rivers. Everything has been lost, his court is scattered, his treasury is looted, his people are terrified, paying tribute to the invaders or fleeing for their lives. From his damp, miserable island refuge at Athelstan, he can see the smoke from Viking camps on the horizon. To any rational observer, the story is over. The long, slow process of building a civilization in this land after the Romans left has come to a brutal end. The future of this island will be Scandinavian. Its gods will be Odin and Thor. Its language will be Old Norse. The very idea of an English people is about to be extinguished before it has ever truly been born. But in the heart of this defeated king, something other than despair is taking root. It is a cold, hard, calculating fury. He is not just planning to survive, he is planning to return. He is planning a war that will decide not just the fate of his kingdom, but the destiny of a nation for the next 1,000 years. What happens next, in these swamps and on the battlefields to come, is the reason the language you are hearing right now is English and not a dialect of Danish. This is the story of how England was almost destroyed before it even existed. It is a story that spans a millennium, from the day the Roman legions first stormed the beaches of a savage island, to the moment a Saxon king drew a line in the mud and refused to retreat any further. It is the story of three great invasions, three clashing civilizations, and the violent, chaotic, and improbable forging of a nation. We will witness the rise and fall of the Roman province of Britannia, a land of straight roads and heated villas on the edge of a crumbling empire. We will journey into the so-called Dark Ages, as new peoples, the Angles and the Saxons, crossed the sea to build a new world on the ruins of the old. And we will stand on the shield wall against the terrifying might of the Viking Age, a force that brought the most powerful kingdoms in Europe to their knees. This is not just a story of kings and battles. It is the story of how identity is made. What does it mean to be Roman, or British, or Saxon, or Viking? And how, from this violent crucible of cultures, did something new, something called English, emerge? We will explore how the fall of an empire creates a vacuum that unleashes chaos, how external threats can force a fragmented people to unite or be annihilated, and how the decisions of a few key individuals standing at the precipice of history can shape the world we inhabit today. The borders of modern Europe, the languages we speak, the very idea of the nation-state were all hammered into shape in these forgotten centuries. To understand how England was born, we must first travel back to a time when it was not even a dream, to an island on the wild frontier of the known world, waiting for the tramp of Roman sandals. Before the eagle standards of Rome ever cast a shadow on its shores, the island of Britain was a world of its own. It was a place of deep forests, trackless marshlands, and rolling hills shrouded in mist. This was not a single, unified land, but a patchwork of hundreds of tribal territories, each with its own king, its own customs, its own fierce sense of independence. The people who lived here were the Britons, a Celtic people whose ancestors had inhabited this land for millennia. They were skilled metalworkers, crafting intricate jewelry of gold and bronze. They were formidable warriors, their bodies painted with blue woad, charging into battle on swift, terrifying chariots. And their spiritual life was guided by the enigmatic Druids, priests who held immense power, acting as judges, teachers, and conduits to the gods of the natural world. They were a people tied to the land, to the seasons, to the ancient spirits they believed dwelled in the sacred groves and flowing springs. To the Romans, this was a place at the very edge of the map, a mythical, almost supernatural island of barbarians, tin, and pearls. Julius Caesar had made two brief expeditions in 55 and 54 BCE, less a conquest and more a violent reconnaissance. He fought the Britons, saw their courage, and recognized the island's potential wealth, but he left. For nearly a century, Britain remained beyond the grasp of the empire. a tantalizing prize and a source of political instability on Gaul's northern flank. Then in the year 43 CE, everything changed. In Rome, a new emperor sat on the throne. His name was Claudius. He was an unlikely ruler, a scholar with a limp and a stutter who had survived the murderous court politics of his predecessors largely by being underestimated. Claudius needed something to cement his authority, to prove to the legions and the Senate that he was a true Roman emperor. He needed a glorious military victory, and his eyes turned north to the misty island his great uncle Caesar had failed to tame. The invasion force that gathered on the shores of Gaul was immense. 4 legions, around 20,000 elite Roman soldiers, supplemented by another 20,000 auxiliaries. This was not a raid, it was a systematic conquest. Landing in Kent, the Roman war machine began its inexorable advance. Against the disciplined, heavily armored legionaries, the wild charges of the Celtic tribes, however brave, were ultimately futile. The Romans fought not just with swords but with engineering. They built roads, straight as an arrow, that cut through forests and across marshes, allowing their armies to move with terrifying speed. They built fortified camps every night, creating mobile fortresses in the heart of enemy territory. They brought siege engines that could shatter the walls of the Britons' hill forts. One by one, the tribes of the south were defeated, co-opted, or crushed. But the Britons did not submit quietly. The most famous story of resistance comes from the year 60 CE. Prasutagus, the king of the Iceni tribe, had tried to play the Roman game. He allied himself with Rome, hoping to preserve his kingdom. In his will, he left his lands jointly to the Roman emperor and his own 2 daughters, a desperate attempt to secure their future. But upon his death, the local Roman administrators saw only weakness. They ignored the will, flogged his widow, Queen Boudica, and violated his daughters. It was a profound miscalculation. They had mistaken diplomacy for cowardice. What they unleashed was a firestorm of vengeance. Boudica, a queen transformed into a warrior, rallied the Iceni and their neighbors. Her army descended on the new Roman cities, symbols of the occupation. Camulodunum, modern Colchester, the provincial capital, was burned to the ground. Then Londinium, the bustling new port on the Thames. Then Verulamium, near modern St. Albans. The Roman historian Tacitus describes a scene of utter horror: 70,000 Roman citizens and their allies slaughtered, no prisoners taken. For a moment, it seemed as if Roman Britannia would be drowned in blood, but the Roman governor, Suetonius Paulinus, marshaled his legions. On a battlefield somewhere in the English Midlands, the two armies met. Boudica's vast, chaotic tribal host against a thin line of disciplined Roman steel. The result was a massacre. The rebellion was broken, and Boudica took her own life rather than be paraded in a Roman triumph. The revolt's failure sealed the fate of southern Britain. For the next 300 years, it was a province of the Roman Empire. A new hybrid culture emerged. Cities grew, with forums, basilicas, public baths, and amphitheaters. Grand villas with intricate mosaics and underfloor heating were built in the countryside. The language of administration was Latin. The old Celtic gods began to merge with the Roman pantheon. A network of incredible roads, some of which still form the basis of modern British highways, connected the province. And in the north, to hold back the unconquered tribes of Caledonia, the Emperor Hadrian built his famous wall, a 73-mile-long statement of imperial power, marking the absolute limit of the civilized world. But this stability came at a cost. Generations of Britons grew up knowing only Roman peace, Roman law, and Roman protection. They paid taxes to an empire that defended their borders. They forgot how to fight their own wars. The old warrior culture was suppressed, the Druids were wiped out, and the defense of the island was outsourced to professional soldiers from across the empire: Gauls, Spaniards, Thracians. Britannia became a comfortable, prosperous, but ultimately dependent part of a much larger system. And by the late 4th century, that system was beginning to crumble. The Roman Empire was overstretched, beset by internal power struggles and immense pressure on its continental frontiers from Germanic and Gothic tribes. Legions were constantly being pulled out of Britain to fight fires elsewhere. The province became vulnerable. Raiders from Ireland, the Scoti, attacked the western coasts. The Picts poured over Hadrian's Wall from the north. And across the North Sea, new, more dangerous enemies began to appear: Germanic seafaring peoples from the coasts of modern-day Germany and Denmark. The Romans called them Saxons. At first, they were just pirates, hitting coastal settlements in terrifyingly fast ships. But their raids grew bolder, more organized. The Romans built a series of forts along the Saxon shore to counter them, but it was a sign of growing desperation. The final break came in the early 5th century. A usurper, Constantine III, stripped Britain of its remaining troops in a failed bid to become emperor. In the year 410, with Rome itself under attack by the Goths, the Britons sent a desperate plea for help to the Emperor Honorius. The reply he sent back was a death sentence for Roman Britain. After 4 centuries, the eagles were gone. The central authority that had maintained the roads, paid the soldiers, and enforced the law simply vanished. The sophisticated, urbanized, economically complex society of Roman Britain was left rudderless. The villas were abandoned. The cities began to decay. The infrastructure crumbled. Local warlords, Romanized Britons who now called themselves kings, carved out petty kingdoms from the carcass of the old province. They fought amongst themselves for power, their world shrinking, their knowledge of the wider empire fading into memory. Everything still looked stable on the surface, a land of old Roman towns and Christian churches. But small cracks were everywhere. The island was weak, divided, and unprepared. And on the eastern horizon, the ships were coming, not just to raid anymore, but to stay. The Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes were on their way, and they would bring a new language, new gods, and a new name for the land itself. The Age of England was about to begin in chaos and fire. The withdrawal of Roman authority did not lead to a glorious new era of British freedom. It led to a power vacuum, and vacuums in history are always filled with violence. The Romano-British warlords, men with Latin names and fading memories of imperial order, fought each other for control of the dwindling resources. Their world was contracting, the great stone roads slowly being reclaimed by nature, the forums of the cities becoming marketplaces for a simpler agrarian society. They were a people haunted by the ghosts of a greater civilization, unable to replicate it, struggling just to hold on, and they were beset on all sides. The Picts from the north, the Irish from the west, and most ominously, the Saxons from the east. The traditional story told by early chroniclers like Gildas is one of catastrophe. A British king named Vortigern, desperate for allies in his internal struggles, made a fatal mistake. He hired Saxon mercenaries to fight for him. They came, they fought, and they saw a rich land poorly defended. They sent word back home, and more came. Soon the mercenaries turned on their employers. What began as a trickle became a flood. Fleets of long, shallow draft boats landed on the shores of Kent, Sussex, and East Anglia. These were the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes, Germanic peoples from the northern coast of Europe, themselves under pressure from other migrating tribes. They were not a unified army with a single leader, but a collection of war bands, each led by a chieftain seeking land, plunder, and glory. The historical reality was likely more complex than a single act of betrayal. It was probably a process that unfolded over generations, a mix of violent invasion, gradual migration, and cultural assimilation. But the end result was the same. Over the next 2 centuries, the eastern and southern parts of the island were fundamentally transformed. The invaders were pagan, worshipping gods of war and nature like Woden and Thunor. They spoke a Germanic tongue, completely alien to the Celtic and Latin speakers of Britain. They were a rural people, building their settlements of wood and thatch, often avoiding the decaying stone cities of the Romans. The native Britons fought back. This is the shadowy period of history that gave birth to the legends of King Arthur, a great Romano-British war leader who, the stories say, won a series of stunning victories against the invaders and held back the tide for a generation. Whether Arthur was a real man or a composite folk memory, the resistance was ultimately doomed. The Germanic settlers had a relentless demographic advantage, and the Britons were politically fragmented. Bit by bit, the newcomers conquered and settled the most fertile parts of the island. The Britons were either subjugated, absorbed, or driven west into the mountainous regions of Wales and Cornwall and across the sea to Brittany. In the lands the invaders conquered, a new society emerged. The Romano-Celtic culture was largely erased. A new language, which we now call Old English, took root. The land itself began to be called Angleland or England. By the year 700, the political map of this New England was a patchwork of warring kingdoms known as the Heptarchy. There were 7 major kingdoms: Kent, Sussex, Essex, Wessex, East Anglia, Mercia, and Northumbria. For the next 2 centuries, these Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were locked in a constant struggle for supremacy. For a time, Northumbria in the north was the dominant power, experiencing a golden age of art and learning in its monasteries. Then the great Midland Kingdom of Mercia rose to prominence, its powerful king, Offa building a massive earthen dike to mark his border with the Welsh and dealing with the Emperor Charlemagne as an equal. The kingdoms converted to Christianity, linking them to the wider culture of Europe, but this did not stop them from fighting each other. It was an age of ambitious kings, shifting alliances, and brutal, localized warfare. They were slowly, violently building a more consolidated political world, but there was something none of them had yet seen. A new threat was gathering across the North Sea, a threat that would make their internal squabbles seem trivial, a threat that would burn their golden age to ashes. On a calm summer's day in the year 793, the monks of Lindisfarne, a holy island off the coast of Northumbria, saw strange ships approaching. These were not the trading vessels they were used to. They were long, sleek, and menacing, with dragon-proud heads and single square sails. The men who disembarked were not merchants, they were warriors. They fell upon the monastery with shocking speed and brutality. They slaughtered the monks, desecrated the altar, and carried off the church's treasures, golden crosses, silver chalices, and priceless illuminated manuscripts. The raid on Lindisfarne sent a shockwave of horror through Christian Europe. A scholar at the court of Charlemagne wrote, "Never before has such a terror appeared in Britain. It was the beginning of the Viking Age." For the next 50 years, the raids continued. The Vikings, or Norsemen, came from Scandinavia, mostly Denmark and Norway. They were master shipbuilders and navigators. Their longships were technological marvels, capable of crossing the open ocean but with a shallow enough draft to sail far up rivers, striking deep into the heart of a kingdom at targets that had always considered themselves safe. Monasteries, rich and undefended, were their favorite targets. At first, they were summer raiders. They would appear, plunder, and vanish before any real defense could be organized. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, with no standing armies and no navies, were helpless. But in the mid-9th century, the nature of the threat changed dramatically. The raids became larger, more organized. The Vikings began to overwinter in England, establishing fortified camps. They were no longer just raiding, they were preparing for conquest. Then in the autumn of 865, the game changed forever. A massive Viking fleet landed in East Anglia. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle calls it the Missile Heathen here, the Great Heathen Army. This was not a raiding party. It was an army of invasion, numbering in the thousands, led by legendary figures like Ivar the Boneless and Halfdan Ragnarsson. Its goal was not just plunder, but land, settlement, and total subjugation. The Great Heathen Army was a terrifyingly efficient military machine. It was mobile, ruthless, and strategically brilliant. For the next decade, it carved a path of destruction through England. In 866, it marched north and seized the city of York, shattering the kingdom of Northumbria. In 869, it turned on East Anglia. The East Anglian king, Edmund, was captured, tied to a tree, shot full of arrows, and beheaded. His kingdom was absorbed into the Viking domain. Then, in 874, the army struck at the heart of England, overwhelming the great kingdom of Mercia and driving its king into exile. In less than 10 years, 3 of the 4 great Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had been destroyed. The Viking conquest seemed irresistible. A vast swathe of northern and eastern England was now under their control, a territory that would become known as the Danelaw. Only one kingdom was left, the kingdom of the West Saxons, Wessex. Wessex was now the last bastion of Anglo-Saxon independence, the final line of defense against the complete pagan conquest of England. Its king was a young man named Alfred. Alfred had not been expected to be king. He was the youngest of 5 brothers. He was a scholar, a man who loved books and learning, but history had called him to be a warrior. From the moment he took the throne in 871, his reign was one long, desperate war for survival. For years, he fought the great army to a bloody stalemate. He would win a battle only to see a new Viking army arrive. He would pay them to leave only to have them return the next year. It was a relentless, grinding war of attrition. Then, in the winter of 878, the Vikings launched a surprise attack. Led by a powerful king named Guthrum, they stormed Alfred's royal estate at Chippenham while he was celebrating Christmas. The West Saxon army was scattered. Alfred himself barely escaped with his life, fleeing with a handful of followers into the dense, watery wilderness of the Somerset Levels. It was the lowest point. The last Anglo-Saxon kingdom had, for all intents and purposes, fallen. Alfred was reduced to a guerrilla leader hiding out on the small island of Athelney surrounded by marshes. This was the moment of absolute crisis, the moment a lesser man would have given up or fled into exile. But Alfred was not a lesser man. From his swamp fortress, he sent out messengers to the feuds, the local militias of Somerset, Wiltshire, and Hampshire. He called the loyal men of Wessex to a rendezvous point, a place called Egbert's Stone, and in the spring an army began to assemble. Men emerged from the woods and hills, farmers and thanes who had thought their king was dead and their cause was lost. They had one last chance to save their world, and they were willing to risk everything. Alfred led his new army out of the marshes and marched to meet Guthrum's Vikings. The fate of England would be decided at a place called Eddington. The battle, when it came, was ferocious. It was a clash of shield walls, a brutal, close-quarters affair of spear, sword, and axe that lasted for hours. The Anglo-Saxons, fighting for their homes, their faith, and their very existence, found a strength they did not know they had. They broke the Viking shield wall. The Vikings fled in panic back to their fortress at Chippenham. Alfred pursued them and laid siege. After 2 weeks, starving and utterly defeated, Guthrum surrendered. But what Alfred did next was the act of a true statesman, not just a conqueror. He did not slaughter his defeated enemies. Instead, he made a treaty. Guthrum and his chief men were to accept Christian baptism with Alfred himself as godfather. The Vikings would then withdraw and settle permanently in the lands they already controlled, the Danelaw. A formal border was drawn. It was a stunningly pragmatic solution. Alfred recognized he couldn't expel the Vikings, so he integrated their leader into his Christian world and created a stable frontier. The victory at Eddington saved Wessex, but Alfred knew it was only a temporary reprieve. To secure the future, he would have to completely transform his kingdom. He began a radical program of reforms. He reorganized the army, creating a rotation system so that half the men were always ready for battle while the other half tended their farms. He built a navy, designing new, larger ships to intercept the Vikings at sea. Most importantly, he created a network of fortified towns, or burhs, across his kingdom. These were not just forts, they were defended urban centers laid out on a grid system where the local population could take refuge and from which soldiers could ride out to meet any attack. It was a revolutionary system of national defense. But Alfred's vision went beyond the military. He believed that the Viking invasions were a punishment from God for the decline of learning and religion in England, so he set about a cultural revival. He learned Latin himself and gathered scholars from across Europe to his court. He began a massive project to translate the most important books from Latin into Old English so that his people could read them. He established schools and reinstituted the rule of law. He was not just trying to save Wessex. He was trying to create a new, unified Christian English identity, one strong enough to withstand the pagan Danes and eventually to reclaim what had been lost. When Alfred died in 899, he was not the king of all England, but he had saved it. He had laid the foundations upon which a unified nation could be built. The task of finishing the job fell to his children, his son, Edward the Elder, and his remarkable daughter, Aethelfled, the Lady of the Mercians. Working in a brilliant political and military partnership, they began the slow, methodical reconquest of the Danelaw. They continued Alfred's strategy, building burhs as they advanced, securing each piece of territory before moving on to the next. The final act of unification came with Alfred's grandson, Athelstan. He was a formidable warrior and a brilliant diplomat. In 927, he marched north and took the great Viking city of York, driving out its Norse king. For the first time, one king ruled all the lands of the English people, Saxon and Dane alike. His claim was put to the ultimate test in 937 at the legendary Battle of Brunanburh. A massive coalition of his enemies, the Norse king of Dublin, the king of Scotland, and the king of Strathclyde, invaded northern England. Athelstan met them with a combined army of West Saxons and Mercians. The battle was immense, a slaughter that lasted all day and became the subject of epic poems. Athelstan won a crushing victory. It confirmed the dominance of the House of Wessex and sealed the unification of England. He was no longer just the king of the West Saxons. He was the king of the English, the Rex Anglorum. From the ashes of the Roman collapse and the fires of the Viking invasions, a new kingdom had finally been born. The victory at Brunanburh in 937 was more than just a successful battle. It was the birth announcement of a new nation-state. For the first time, the fragmented, warring kingdoms of the Anglo-Saxons and the settled territories of the Danes were united under a single crown, that of Athelstan, king of all the English. The immediate impact was a fundamental redrawing of the political map of Britain. The old identities of Mercian, Northumbrian, and East Anglian were now subsumed into a larger, overarching identity: English. The kingdom Athelstan forged was, by the standards of 10th century Europe, remarkably centralized and well administered, a legacy of the defensive innovations Alfred had been forced to create. The network of burhs became thriving commercial and administrative centers. The shire system, a way of dividing the kingdom into manageable administrative units, was extended across the country. A standardized royal coinage was minted, a powerful symbol of a single economic and political authority. In the first year, the first decade after unification, this new English kingdom was a powerhouse in the British Isles. Athelstan's court was a center of European diplomacy. His sisters married off to the most powerful rulers on the continent, from the Holy Roman Emperor to the King of the West Franks. But the legacy of the Viking Age was far from over. England was now a hybrid nation. In the Danelaw, the northeastern half of the country, the population was largely of Scandinavian descent. While they were now Athelstan's subjects, they retained their own laws, customs, and dialects. This created a permanent cultural and political fault line within the new kingdom. The integration of this Anglo-Scandinavian population would be the great challenge for Athelstan's successors. Decades later, the Viking threat returned, not as an invading army of conquest, but as a new wave of destructive raids from a more organized and powerful Danish kingdom. English kings were forced to pay enormous sums of tribute, the infamous Danegeld, to buy off the attackers, a policy that drained the treasury and revealed the lingering military vulnerabilities of the island kingdom. This culminated in the early 11th century with the conquest of England by the Danish king, Cnut the Great. For a brief but brilliant period, England became the jewel in the crown of a vast North Sea empire that also included Denmark, Norway, and parts of Sweden. Cnut's reign, however, was not a simple foreign occupation. He ruled as an English king, respecting Anglo-Saxon laws and working with the existing church and nobility. His rule further cemented the Anglo-Scandinavian character of the nation, proving that England's destiny was inextricably linked to the politics of the North Sea world. Looking back from today, the legacy of this thousand-year saga is written all over the modern world. The most obvious legacy is the English language itself. It is a Germanic language brought by the Angles and Saxons, not a Latin-based language like French or Spanish, which is a direct result of the Anglo-Saxon migrations displacing the Romano-Celtic culture. But it is also a language profoundly enriched by the Vikings. Thousands of common English words, especially in the north of England, have their roots in Old Norse. Words like sky, skin, leg, window, husband, and even the verb are come from the language of the Vikings. The very structure of English grammar, with its simplified endings compared to other Germanic languages, may be a result of the intense daily contact and intermingling of Old English and Old Norse speakers in the Danelaw, forcing the language to become simpler to facilitate communication. The physical landscape of England also bears the scars and structures of this history. The great Roman roads, like Watling Street and the Fosse Way, still form the backbone of the country's transportation network. The layout of many historic English towns, with their regular street plans and surrounding walls, is a direct inheritance of Alfred the Great's system of fortified burhs. The county boundaries we know today are often descended from the Anglo-Saxon shires. Even the location of parish churches can sometimes be traced back to the wooden churches of the newly converted Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Furthermore, the very concept of English national identity was forged in this period. It was Alfred's desperate defense of a shared Christian, Anglo-Saxon culture against the pagan other of the Vikings that first created a powerful idea of a unified English people. This narrative of a resilient island nation, defined by its struggle against foreign invaders, became a cornerstone of English identity, a story that would be told and retold for centuries, especially in times of national crisis. It is the deep, foundational myth of a nation born from resistance. It is fascinating to engage in a little counterfactual history. What if Alfred had failed? What if he had been killed in the swamps of Athelney or lost the Battle of Eddington? It is almost certain that Wessex would have fallen just like the other kingdoms. England would likely have become a collection of Scandinavian kingdoms, speaking a Norse language and integrated fully into the Scandinavian cultural world. The history of the British Isles, and by extension the history of Europe and the world, would have unfolded in a completely different direction. There would have been no unified English kingdom for the Normans to conquer in 1066. The distinct legal and political traditions that evolved into English common law and parliamentary democracy may never have developed. The global spread of the English language, the foundation of the modern interconnected world, would simply not have happened. The survival of that one king in that one moment of crisis truly was one of the great turning points in world history. It ensured that the future of the island would be English, a complex synthesis of Roman, Celtic, Anglo-Saxon, and Viking influences, but a culture with its own unique and powerful trajectory. The epic thousand-year story of England's birth, from the fall of Rome to the unification under Athelstan, is more than just a sequence of dramatic events. It is a powerful case study in the grand, repeating patterns of history, and it offers profound insights into the nature of civilization, power, and human society itself. When we strip away the specifics of time and place, we can see timeless forces at work, forces that have shaped countless other nations and continue to shape our world today. One of the most powerful patterns we witness is the cycle of order, collapse, and reorganization. The Roman Empire represented a powerful, centralized order. It imposed stability, law, and a shared infrastructure over a vast and diverse area, but this order created dependency. When the central authority collapsed, as all oversized empires eventually do, the provinces like Britannia, which had forgotten how to defend themselves, were plunged into chaos. This is a recurring lesson of history. Centralized systems provide security, but they often do so at the cost of local resilience. The sudden absence of that central power often leads to a violent, fragmented dark age, as local warlords and new peoples rush to fill the void. What determines the future is which of these new, smaller groups can create a new, more durable form of order. This leads directly to a second critical pattern, the role of external threat as a catalyst for state formation. The Anglo-Saxon heptarchy was a perfect example of political fragmentation. The Seven Kingdoms were content, for the most part, to exist in a state of endemic, low-level warfare and rivalry. There was no compelling internal reason for them to unite into a single, larger entity. It took an existential threat, a force so powerful and destructive that it threatened to annihilate their entire culture, the Great Heathen Army, to force them to overcome their rivalries. The choice became simple: unite or be destroyed. Wessex, under Alfred, became the nucleus of this unification precisely because it was the last kingdom standing, the only one capable of mounting a defense. This pattern is seen again and again throughout history. The Greek city-states united against Persia. The Swiss cantons formed a confederation to resist the Habsburgs. Nations are rarely born from peaceful consensus. They are almost always forged in the crucible of a shared life-or-death struggle. This story also provides a masterclass in the nature of human leadership. We see different models in sharp contrast. There is the imperial ambition of Claudius, using conquest as a tool for personal political validation. There is the brutal pragmatism of the Viking leaders, driven by a rational search for wealth and land. And then there is Alfred. What makes him Alfred the Great is not just that he won a pivotal battle. It is that his vision transcended mere survival. He understood that to defeat the Vikings in the long run, he couldn't just build a better army, he had to build a better society. His focus on law, education, and a shared cultural and religious identity was a form of soft power that was ultimately more resilient than the Vikings' military might. He was fighting not just for territory, but for an idea, the idea of a Christian, literate English kingdom. It teaches us that true nation building is about more than just military victory. It's about creating a compelling story that people can believe in and belong to. Finally, the entire narrative forces us to reflect on the complex and often violent nature of identity. Is identity based on bloodline, language, religion, or place? Over these centuries, the inhabitants of England saw themselves as Britons, then as Romans, then as Saxons or Angles, then as subjects of Mercia or Wessex, and finally as English. Each of these identities was fluid, contested, and ultimately shaped by conquest and assimilation. The final English identity was not a pure Anglo-Saxon one. It was a hybrid, a synthesis that absorbed elements from the Celts, the Romans, and especially the Danes. It reminds us that no culture is a sealed container. All cultures are the product of mixing, borrowing, and conflict. The very notion of a pure, national identity is a historical fiction. As we look back, we are left with a series of profound and open questions. How much of a society's success is determined by its great leaders, and how much by the deep, impersonal forces of geography and economics? What is the right balance between centralized control and local autonomy? When a culture is conquered, what parts of it die and what parts survive by being absorbed into the new order? Does progress always require a violent break with the past, or can it be achieved through gradual evolution? In an age of globalization, are we seeing the decline of the nation-state that was born in this era, or are we seeing new external pressures that might force new forms of unity? The story of England's birth does not provide easy answers, but it offers a timeless reminder that our world is the contingent product of past struggles, and that the future is constantly being shaped by how we respond to the crises of our own time. So we have journeyed through 1,000 years of chaos and creation. We stood with the Roman legionary on Hadrian's Wall, staring into the wild north. We watched the last imperial ships sail away, leaving a province to fend for itself. We saw the arrival of the Anglo-Saxons, who laid the linguistic and cultural foundations of a new world. And we took shelter in the swamps with Alfred the Great, the king who refused to let that world die and who rose from the ashes of defeat to lay the groundwork for a unified nation. From the clash of these three worlds, the Roman, the Saxon, and the Norse, the political entity we call England was born. It is a stunning reminder that history is not inevitable. The world we live in was not destined to be. It was built on a series of knife-edge moments, of desperate gambles and improbable victories. The survival of the English language, the existence of the English nation, the very shape of the map of Western Europe, all hinged on the outcome of those forgotten struggles in a remote corner of the world. The story, of course, does not end there. The kingdom forged by Athelstan would soon face its next great test. If you found the story of how Alfred's reforms built a nation fascinating, you might be interested in seeing how that nation was completely transformed in a single day in 1066 by the Norman conquest. Or if the saga of the Vikings captured your imagination, perhaps we could follow their other paths of exploration and conquest. From their establishment of a dynasty in Normandy to their epic voyages across the Atlantic to North America, 500 years before Columbus. We could even explore the remarkable story of Cnut the Great, the Viking who returned not to raid England, but to rule it as the center of a mighty North Sea empire. Let me know in the comments which of these epic stories you would like to see us tackle next. The past is never truly past. It is a landscape we all inhabit, its ancient foundations lying just beneath the surface of our modern world. The map of our world is drawn in the ink of crisis, and the story of England was written in the fires of the Viking Age.